The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched before Jake Morrison like a vast arena of judgment. 43 different species sat in their designated sections, each group representing worlds that spanned the galaxy. The air hummed with translation devices working overtime to convert thousands of different languages into something everyone could understand. Jake stood alone at the center of it all, his hands clasped behind his back, his face showing nothing of what he felt inside. Behind him sat the other human representatives. Captain Lisa Hayes wore her blue Earth Defense Fleet uniform, the silver stars on her collar catching the artificial light. Dr. Ryan Cooper had his usual wrinkled lab coat and nervous habit of adjusting his glasses every few seconds. They had traveled 3 months to reach this place, and now they waited to hear words that everyone already knew were coming. The council speaker, Veltar of the Zenthari Empire, rose from his elevated platform. His tall frame moved with the grace that all Zenthari possessed, but his 4 eyes held no warmth as they focused on the humans below. The chamber fell silent except for the soft whir of air recyclers and the distant hum of the station's massive engines. The Council has reviewed all evidence presented regarding the human species and their actions in galactic space, Veltar began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics. The charges are serious and well documented. Humanity stands accused of excessive military aggression, violation of the sacred non-interference doctrine, and unauthorized expansion of armed forces beyond approved limits. Jake had heard these words before during the long weeks of testimony. The Catherian Empire had presented their case with typical dramatic flair, showing recordings of human ships destroying their vessels near the colony world of Haven Prime. What they had not mentioned was that those same Catherian ships had been attacking civilian transports carrying families and children. The humans had tried to explain this during their defense, but the Council seemed to have already made up their minds. The evidence shows that human military forces engaged in combat operations that resulted in the complete destruction of 17 Catherian vessels, Veltar continued. Furthermore, intelligence reports indicate that humans have been building defense stations and weapons platforms without proper council oversight. These actions demonstrate a pattern of behavior that threatens the peace we have maintained for over 3 centuries. Dr. Cooper shifted in his seat, and Jake heard the soft squeak of the man's nervous breathing. The doctor had spent 5 years developing medical treatments that worked across different alien biologies, treatments that had saved thousands of lives during the plague outbreak in the Rigel sector. None of that seemed to matter now. The human Representative Jake Morrison was given the opportunity to present a defense, Veltar said, gesturing toward Jake with one of his 4 arms. While his words were noted and considered, they do not change the fundamental facts of human aggression and disregard for established galactic law. Jake remembered his speech to the Council 3 days earlier. He had tried to explain that humans only fought when others were in danger, that every weapon they built was designed to protect rather than conquer. He had shown them records of human medical teams working in war zones, human engineers rebuilding destroyed infrastructure on alien worlds, human negotiators helping settle disputes between species that had been enemies for generations. The Council had listened politely and then dismissed everything he said. Captain Hayes had wanted to present military records showing how human forces had prevented 14 separate conflicts in the past 2 years alone. She had data proving that human-patrolled space lanes had the lowest piracy rates in the galaxy. But the Council had ruled such evidence irrelevant to the charges at hand. Therefore, Veltar announced, his voice growing stronger, this Council finds humanity guilty of all charges presented. The sentence is immediate expulsion from the Galactic Council and all associated benefits and protections. The chamber erupted in a mixture of approving clicks, whistles, and other sounds that Jake's translator couldn't quite process. Some species seemed pleased with the decision, while others appeared uncertain. The Aquatic Union delegation was making their equivalent of worried murmurs, and several smaller species looked genuinely distressed. All human settlements beyond the Sol system must be evacuated within one standard galactic year, Veltar continued, once the noise died down. Earth and its moon will be placed under strict quarantine. No human vessels will be permitted to travel beyond the boundaries of your home system. All trade agreements and diplomatic relations are hereby terminated. Jake had expected this outcome, but hearing the words spoken aloud still felt like a physical blow. Behind him, he heard Dr. Cooper's sharp intake of breath and the soft creak of Captain Hayes's chair as she gripped the armrests. A full year to abandon everything humans had built among the stars. Colonies that housed millions of people, research stations studying phenomena that could benefit all species, defensive platforms protecting trade routes used by dozens of different civilizations. When Veltar's gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber, Jake Morrison did something that surprised everyone present. He simply nodded once, turned around, and walked toward the exit. Captain Hayes and Dr. Cooper followed without a word, their footsteps loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the chamber. No protests, no angry speeches, no threats or pleas for reconsideration. The humans simply accepted their fate and left with the same quiet dignity they had shown throughout the entire proceeding. As the doors closed behind them, many council members exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected drama, emotion, perhaps even violence. The calm acceptance felt wrong somehow, like the moment before a storm when the air grows still and heavy with unspoken threat. Captain Ben Parker had seen many strange things during his 40 years of service with the Zenthari monitoring fleet, but nothing quite like this. His ship, the Star's Edge, hung in orbit above Kepler 442b, and his instruments told him a story that made no sense at all. According to every sensor reading, the mining colony below was operating normally. Power levels were steady, atmospheric processors were running, and the massive extraction equipment continued its work of pulling rare metals from the planet's crust. The only problem was that 18,000 colonists had simply vanished. Send. "Another scanning pulse!" Ben ordered his sensor operator, a young Zenthari named Kickstar, who had joined the crew only 6 months earlier. "Focus on life signs, any biological traces at all." The results came back the same as the previous dozen. Scans. 0 human life signatures detected anywhere on the planet's surface. No bodies. No remains. Nothing to suggest what had happened to an entire colony's worth of people. Ben had been monitoring human space for the past 3 months, ever since the Council's expulsion order went into effect. At first, everything had seemed normal. Human ships continued their regular patrols, trade vessels maintained their schedules, and communication chatter from human settlements followed typical patterns. Then, about 6 weeks ago, something changed. The first sign had been subtle. A research station in the Vega system simply stopped responding to routine communications. When a hegemony patrol ship investigated, they found the station fully operational, but completely empty. Personal belongings remained in living quarters, experiments continued running in automated laboratories, but every single human had disappeared without explanation. Similar reports began coming in from across human space. Colonies, outposts, trading stations, and military bases all going silent in the same mysterious way. Each location was found intact and functional, but devoid of human life. It was as if the entire species had decided to play an elaborate game of hide-and-seek with the rest of the galaxy. "Sir," Kickstar called from his station, "I'm detecting something unusual in the colony's computer systems. It looks like a complete data purge was initiated approximately 72 hours ago." Ben moved to look over his operator's shoulder at the readouts. The colony's main computers showed massive deletions across all databases. Personnel records, research data, communication logs, even routine maintenance schedules had been systematically erased. However, the basic operational programs that kept the mining equipment running remained untouched. They wanted the machinery to keep working. Ben muttered, more to himself than to his crew. But they took everything else with them. On the other side of the galaxy, Dr. Elena Rodriguez was experiencing her own version of this strange exodus firsthand. As the chief administrator of New Vermont, humanity's most successful agricultural colony, she had been tasked with overseeing what the evacuation orders called a complete withdrawal of human presence. Elena had initially assumed this meant packing up the colonists and their personal belongings, perhaps leaving behind the infrastructure for other species to claim later. She had been wrong about the scope of what humanity intended to accomplish. The evacuation fleet that arrived at New Vermont consisted of more than just passenger transports. Massive cargo haulers brought specialized equipment that Elena had never seen before. Teams of technicians worked around the clock, carefully extracting every trace of human genetic material from the planet's ecosystem. They collected seeds from crop fields that had been growing for 20 years. They gathered soil samples that contained Earth-origin bacteria introduced by the original colonists. They even captured and relocated the descendants of Earth animals that had been brought to help establish the colony's ecosystem. Nothing that carried human DNA or had been significantly altered by human presence was left behind. "Are you really taking the bees, too?" Elena asked Dr. Nancy Foster, the geneticist leading the extraction operation. Nancy looked up from a specialized containment unit filled with honeycombs. "Every single one. These are descendants of Earth. Honeybees that we've spent decades adapting to this planet's flowers. Their genetic information represents years of careful biological engineering." Elena watched as teams loaded the last of the grain silos onto transport ships. The scale of the operation was staggering. Not only were they relocating 40,000 colonists, they were essentially erasing any evidence that humans had ever lived on New Vermont. The automated farming equipment would continue operating, maintaining crop yields that would feed millions of people across multiple star systems, but the crops themselves would be generic varieties that any species could have developed. Across human space, similar scenes played out on dozens of worlds. The evacuation of Titan Research Station took 6 weeks to complete, but when the last ship departed, observers found that the humans had somehow managed to remove every single piece of research equipment while leaving the station's basic life support and communication systems intact. The station now served as a perfectly functional deep space waypoint, but all the advanced scientific instruments that had made it famous were gone. The mining operation on Ceres continued extracting asteroids and processing raw materials, but the sophisticated refining techniques that had made human mining operations 40% more efficient than anyone else's had been carefully deleted from all computer systems. The raw materials still flowed to galactic markets, but the knowledge of how to process them most effectively had vanished along with the humans who developed it. What puzzled alien observers most was the coordination involved in these evacuations. 43 separate human settlements across 27 star systems had all managed to complete their withdrawals within the same 2-week period, despite being separated by distances that should have made such coordination impossible. The logistics alone should have taken months of planning and preparation. Captain Ben Parker filed his report on Kepler 442b with growing unease. The humans had not simply abandoned their colonies in haste or anger. They had methodically removed themselves from galactic civilization while leaving behind just enough infrastructure to prevent immediate economic collapse. The mining equipment continued operating because dozens of other species depended on those raw materials. The agricultural systems kept producing food because entire sectors relied on those crops to feed their populations. It was as if the humans had carefully analyzed every possible consequence of their departure and had taken steps to minimize the immediate damage to everyone else. They were being considerate even while being expelled, and that consideration somehow made their absence feel more ominous than any act of revenge could have. As Ben's ship prepared to leave Kepler 442b, his communications officer picked up a faint signal from the planet's surface. It was a simple text message, transmitted on all standard galactic frequencies and repeated in every major language. We wish you well in all your future endeavors. May you find the peace that has eluded us together. The message was unsigned, but Ben knew exactly who had sent it. Admiral Kate Sullivan had been dead for 3 months, but her absence was destroying the galaxy. The realization hit Council Speaker Veltar as he stared at reports flooding in from the Outer Rim territories. Border conflicts that had been dormant for decades were suddenly erupting into open warfare. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for generations were collapsing. Communication networks that connected distant civilizations were failing one by one, all because a single human admiral was no longer there to coordinate the neutral zone patrol. Veltar had never heard of Kate Sullivan until her name appeared in a dozen different crisis reports. According to the files his staff had hastily compiled, she had been a quiet career officer who spent most of her time in deep space, commanding a small fleet of ships that patrolled the disputed territories between the Catherian Empire and the Asari Federation. Her official role had been listed as Regional Security Coordinator, a position so mundane that the Council had never paid it any attention. What they had not realized was that Kate Sullivan had been personally preventing a war. For 12 years, she had managed the impossible task of keeping 2 hostile empires from destroying each other. The Catherians were an aggressive species that viewed any sign of weakness as an invitation to attack. The Asari were territorial to the point of paranoia, interpreting any movement near their borders as preparation for invasion. Between them lay a region of space containing 17 inhabited systems and some of the galaxy's most important shipping lanes. Admiral Sullivan had somehow convinced both sides to accept human mediation in their disputes. When Catherian battle, groups moved too close to Asari space, she would intercept them with polite but firm requests to alter course. When Asari patrol ships began shadowing Catherian merchant vessels, she would arrange coincidental encounters that defused tensions before they could escalate. Her methods had been so subtle that most people never realized they were witnessing diplomacy. She would invite both sides to joint training exercises that built familiarity and trust. She organized cultural exchange programs that helped each species understand the other's motivations. Most importantly, she maintained a constant presence in the disputed zone, serving as a neutral party that both sides could trust to treat them fairly. Now she was gone, and the carefully maintained balance was collapsing. The first incident occurred when a Catherian supply convoy took what had always been considered a safe route through neutral space. Without Admiral Sullivan's ships providing their usual escort, the convoy wandered slightly off course and entered what the Asari considered their territorial waters. The Asari response was swift and predictable. They dispatched 3 warships to investigate the intrusion. Under normal circumstances, Admiral Sullivan would have contacted both sides, arranged a meeting, and diffused the situation within hours. Instead, the Catherian convoy interpreted the approaching Asari ships as an attack force and called for military assistance. By the time anyone realized what was happening, 12 ships from both sides were locked in combat, and 7 were destroyed. Similar incidents were occurring throughout the galaxy as other human peacekeeping efforts simply vanished. In the Rigel sector, Dr. Paul Grant's early warning network for void spawn incursions had gone offline when his research team disappeared along with all other human personnel. The network had been operating for 15 years, using a combination of deep space sensors and predictive algorithms to identify when the extragalactic predators were approaching inhabited systems. The void spawn were creatures that defied easy classification. They appeared to be made of living crystal, traveled in ships that looked more grown than built, and showed no interest in communication or negotiation. They would arrive without warning, strip a star system of all biological life, and then disappear back into the void between galaxies. Dr. Grant's network had prevented countless attacks by providing advance notice that allowed planetary populations to evacuate or prepare defenses. Now that network was dark, and no one else understood how. It had worked. The communication failures were perhaps the most widespread problem. Captain Lisa Hayes had led a team of human linguists and engineers who maintained the translation protocols that allowed different species to understand each other. What had seemed like routine technical maintenance was actually a complex, ongoing process of updating language databases, calibrating vocal pattern recognition systems, and resolving the countless ambiguities that arose when 43 different species tried to communicate. Without human oversight, the translation systems began producing increasingly garbled results. A simple trade negotiation between the hegemony and the Aquatic Union became a diplomatic crisis when a mistranslated phrase convinced both sides that the other was planning an attack. Peace talks between the Crystal Consortium and the hive mind collapsed when the translators began converting metaphorical expressions into literal threats. The economic consequences were equally severe. The Rigel trade route, a shipping network that connected 12 different sectors, had been designed and maintained by human logistics specialists. The route involved complex scheduling that took into account the travel capabilities of dozens of different ship designs, the political sensitivities of various species, and the seasonal variations in supply and demand across multiple worlds. Human coordinators had spent years building relationships with shipping companies, port authorities, and local governments to create a system that benefited everyone involved. They had negotiated agreements that allowed former enemies to share the same space lanes, established insurance protocols that protected smaller companies from losses, and created backup plans for every possible disruption. When the humans disappeared, the shipping companies initially tried to maintain their schedules using automated systems. Within weeks, the carefully balanced network began falling apart. Ships arrived at ports that were already overcrowded, creating massive delays. Cargo containers filled with perishable goods sat in warehouses for days while bureaucrats tried to process paperwork that had previously been handled by human intermediaries. Insurance claims that should have been resolved in hours stretched into weeks, as different species argued over liability using translation systems that no longer worked properly. But perhaps the most telling sign of humanity's hidden importance came from an unexpected source. HFY, a senior member of the Aquatic Union's governing council, had been reviewing historical records as part of his research into galactic conflict patterns. What he discovered made him question everything the council thought they knew about human behavior. According to his analysis, the number of violent conflicts between different species had dropped by 68% in the years since humanity joined the galactic community. Border disputes, trade wars, territorial conflicts, and ethnic tensions that had plagued the galaxy for centuries had all become significantly less frequent after humans began establishing their presence in neutral territories. The correlation was so strong that HFY initially assumed his data was flawed. He spent weeks double-checking his sources and reviewing the statistical methods he had used. The results remained consistent. Wherever humans established a presence, violence between other species decreased dramatically. More disturbing was the recent trend. In the 3 months since the human evacuation began, the galaxy had experienced more armed conflicts than in the previous 3 years combined. Old grudges that had been dormant for decades were suddenly erupting into open warfare. Species that had been trading partners for generations were now viewing each other with suspicion and hostility. It was as if humanity had been serving as a buffer between the galaxy's more aggressive civilizations, absorbing tensions and diffusing conflicts before they could escalate. Their presence had somehow encouraged other species to resolve their differences peacefully, while their absence was allowing ancient hatreds to resurface. Council Speaker Veltar found himself facing a crisis that grew worse with each passing day. The expulsion of humanity, which had seemed like a reasonable response to their alleged aggression, was proving to be the most destabilizing event in galactic history. The humans had not been a threat to galactic peace. They had been its invisible guardians. The war began with a single mistranslated word. Ambassador Thexhai of the Asari Federation had been attempting to apologize for the convoy incident that had claimed 7 ships and 43 lives. The phrase he used in his native language, roughly translated to, "We accept responsibility for our hasty judgment," but the malfunctioning translation system rendered it as, "We celebrate our decisive victory over your weakness." General Vorthak of the Catherian Empire heard those words through his personal translator and felt his battle rage surge to dangerous levels. In the Catherian mind, celebrating the death of warriors was the gravest possible insult, worthy of blood vengeance that could last for generations. He stood up from the negotiation table, drew his ceremonial blade, and formally declared his clan's honor to be stained until Asari blood had been spilled in equal measure. Council Speaker Veltar tried desperately to intervene, but his own translator was producing equally garbled results. What should have been calming diplomatic language came out as confusing threats and meaningless technical jargon. Within hours, both empires had recalled their ambassadors and begun mobilizing their fleets for what would become the bloodiest conflict in galactic history. The humans had always managed these translation problems with a combination of advanced technology and intuitive understanding of how different species communicated. Dr. Ryan Cooper's linguistic team had spent years studying not just the words that various aliens used, but the cultural context behind those words. They understood that Catherian expressions of respect often sounded like threats to other species, while Asari attempts at friendship could be interpreted as territorial challenges. Without that expertise, the galaxy's communication networks became a source of constant misunderstanding rather than cooperation. Trade negotiations turned into accusations of fraud. Diplomatic ceremonies became unintentional insults. Scientific collaborations collapsed when researchers could no longer understand each other's findings. The war between the Catherians and the Asari quickly spread beyond their original dispute. Both empires began demanding that other species choose sides, threatening economic sanctions against anyone who remained neutral. The hegemony found itself drawn into the conflict when Catherian forces attacked one of their supply convoys, mistaking it for an Asari military transport. The Crystal Consortium retaliated against Asari mining operations that had apparently encroached on their territorial claims, though later investigations suggested the entire incident was based on a mapping error caused by corrupted navigation databases. But the war was only the beginning of the galaxy's troubles. The real catastrophe came from an enemy that most civilizations had forgotten existed. The Void. Spawn emerged from the darkness between galaxies like a plague of living nightmares. Their crystalline ships appeared without warning in the outer rim territories, where Dr. Paul Grant's early warning network had once provided advance notice of their approach. The first 3 star systems to be attacked never even had time to send distress signals before their populations were completely consumed. Commander Ixel of the Hegemony Deep Space Corps was leading a routine patrol mission when her sensors detected the massive energy signatures that indicated a void spawn feeding frenzy. She arrived at the Epsilon Eridani system to find a scene from her species' worst legends. The planets were still there, but they had been stripped of all organic matter down to the bacterial level. Cities remained standing, but they were empty. Shells filled only with the crystalline waste products that the void spawn left behind after consuming all life. Send immediate warnings to all inhabited systems within 50 light years, Ixel ordered her communications officer. Emergency evacuation protocols are now in effect. But the evacuation orders were transmitted through the same failing communication networks that had sparked the war between the Catherians and the Asari. Many worlds received warnings that were so badly translated they were either ignored as false alarms or misunderstood as attacks from neighboring species. Several planetary governments actually refused evacuation assistance because they believed the offers were actually invasion plans. The automated defense platforms that Dr. Grant's team had installed throughout the Outer Rim territories remained operational, but their control systems had been locked to respond only to human biometric signatures. The weapons were powerful enough to destroy Void Spawn attack craft, but without human operators, they remained stubbornly inactive, while the crystal creatures swept through system after system. Dr. Meltar, a Zenthari scientist studying the abandoned human research facilities, made a discovery that filled him with both wonder and despair. Hidden in the deepest archives of the Titan Research Station, he found files detailing humanity's secret project to develop weapons specifically designed to combat void spawn incursions. The research was brilliant in its simplicity. While other species had tried to fight the creatures using conventional energy weapons that proved largely ineffective, the humans had focused on disrupting the quantum resonance frequencies that held the creatures' crystalline structures together. Their prototype weapons could literally cause a void spawn to collapse into harmless mineral dust. Even more impressive was the scope of their preparation. The humans had been sharing this technology freely with all Council member species through carefully disguised research papers and technical specifications. What had appeared to be routine scientific publications about crystal physics and quantum mechanics were actually detailed instructions for building anti-void spawn weapons. But the knowledge was useless without the human engineers who understood how to implement it. The technical documents were written in scientific language that required deep expertise in both human engineering principles and xenobiology to interpret correctly. Without Dr. Grant's team to provide guidance, other species found themselves looking at weapon designs they could not build and defensive strategies they could not execute. The economic collapse that had begun with the failure of human maintained. Trade routes accelerated as war and alien invasion consumed the galaxy's resources. Species that had been prosperous trading partners were now either fighting each other or fleeing from advancing void spawn swarms. The complex financial networks that had allowed different civilizations to share resources and coordinate development began breaking down as trust between species evaporated. The Rigel trade route, which had once carried goods worth trillions of credits between 12 different sectors, now lay empty except for refugee ships fleeing the advancing crisis. The insurance companies that had protected interstellar commerce went bankrupt trying to pay claims for losses they had never imagined possible. Entire planetary economies collapsed when their trading partners suddenly became enemies or were consumed by crystalline predators. In the council chambers, Veltar found himself presiding over emergency sessions that grew more desperate with each passing day. Representatives from 18 different species were missing, their worlds either destroyed by void spawn or cut off by the expanding war zones. The remaining delegates spent their time arguing about blame and responsibility while their civilizations crumbled around them. "We must attempt to contact the humans," declared Zephi of the Aquatic Union during one particularly heated session. "Our analysis clearly shows that their presence was maintaining galactic stability. Without them, we are destroying ourselves." The humans were rightfully expelled for their aggressive behavior, insisted Representative Kelnox of the hegemony. "We cannot show weakness by admitting our mistake." "What mistake?" shouted Ambassador Nixera of the Crystal Consortium. "The mistake was believing that 43 species could maintain peace without someone to mediate our conflicts. The humans were not our conquerors, they were our counselors." But finding the humans proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The evacuation had been so complete and so coordinated that it defied conventional explanation. Entire fleets of ships carrying millions of people had simply vanished from known space without leaving any trace of their destination. Long range. Sensors could detect no signs of human colonies or outposts anywhere within the galaxy's explored regions. It was as if humanity had not merely left the galactic community, but had somehow stepped outside the galaxy itself. And as the crisis deepened with each passing day, the Council faced a terrible truth. They had expelled the one species that had been holding their civilization together, and now they were paying the price for their blindness. Commander Ixel had never seen so many different species working together before. Her flagship, the hegemony vessel Star's Judgment, led a massive fleet of 200 ships representing 12 different civilizations. Zenthari battlecruisers flew alongside Asari patrol vessels, their ancient enmity temporarily set aside in the face of galactic catastrophe. Crystal Consortium mining ships worked with Aquatic Union research vessels, sharing sensor data and navigation information despite decades of territorial disputes. They were searching for humanity, and their desperation had finally overcome their prejudices. The search had been ongoing for 6 weeks, following the faintest traces of human exodus routes across the galaxy's spiral arms. Every abandoned colony, every empty research station, every deactivated defense platform was examined with scientific precision. Teams of specialists analyzed everything from residual engine signatures to microscopic traces of human DNA, hoping to find some clue about where an entire species had disappeared. The breakthrough came in the most unlikely place imaginable. Lieutenant Kexhar, a young Zenthari sensor operator aboard the research vessel Deep Vision, was conducting routine scans of the Andromeda Void when his instruments detected something that should not have existed. The void was exactly what its name suggested, a region of empty space between the galaxy's outer rim and the nearest neighboring star cluster. Nothing lived there, nothing grew there, and according to every scientific model, nothing could survive there. Yet Kexhar's sensors were showing clear evidence of artificial construction. "Commander Ixel," he called over the fleet communication network. "You need to see this immediately." The artifact hung in space like a monument to impossibility. It was clearly artificial, a sleek silver structure about the size of a small moon, but it radiated no heat signatures and showed no signs of active power systems. More puzzling was its location, positioned precisely at the gravitational balance point between 3 different star systems, a location that would require constant course corrections to maintain. "It's a relay station," declared Dr. Amy Turner, the human physicist whose theoretical work on quantum mechanics had been dismissed by most alien scientists as impossible dreaming. But Dr. Turner had been dead for 2 months, killed in a transport accident during the human evacuation. The voice speaking over the communication system belonged to someone else entirely. "This is Dr. Nancy Foster, speaking for the Human Diaspora Council. We have been monitoring your search efforts, and we believe it is time for a conversation." The words sent shockwaves through the search fleet. After months of silence, humanity had finally responded to the galaxy's desperate attempts at contact. But the implications of Dr. Foster's statement were staggering. If humans were monitoring galactic communications from outside known space, they possessed technology far beyond anything the Council had imagined. "Dr. Foster," Commander Ixel responded, trying to keep her voice steady, "the Galactic Council formally requests permission to negotiate for humanity's return. Our civilization is facing multiple crises that require your expertise to resolve." There was a long pause before the response came. "Commander, I'm afraid you misunderstand our situation. Humanity has not simply relocated to a distant star system. We have found a new home that exists outside the normal boundaries of galactic space." The relay station began transmitting detailed technical specifications that left the fleet's scientists speechless. The data described a breakthrough in quantum mechanics that allowed for the creation of stable pocket dimensions, artificially constructed reality bubbles that existed parallel to normal space-time. The mathematics involved were so complex that most of the alien physicists couldn't even understand the basic principles involved. Dr. Amy Turner's research was not theoretical speculation, Dr. Foster continued. It was a practical guide to dimensional engineering. While the Council was debating humanity's fate, our scientists were perfecting the technology needed to create our own universe. The scope of human preparation became clear as more details emerged. For decades, humanity had been quietly developing contingency plans for the possibility that they might need to leave galactic civilization behind. The Dimensional Engineering Project had begun as a scientific curiosity, but it had evolved into a comprehensive backup plan that involved relocating not just people, but entire ecosystems and industrial infrastructures. The evacuation that had seemed impossibly coordinated now made perfect sense. Humans had not been fleeing to distant stars. They had been stepping sideways into a parallel reality that they had constructed specifically for their own use. The pocket dimension was completely self-contained, with artificial planets, controlled, climate systems and resources extracted from the quantum foundation of reality itself. But why? Asked HFY of the Aquatic Union, his voice carrying the weight of his species' grief. Why go to such extraordinary lengths instead of simply defending yourselves against the Council's accusations? Because we learned long ago that being right is not the same as being believed, Dr. Foster replied. Humanity spent 300 years on Earth fighting wars over misunderstandings, prejudices, and the inability of different groups to coexist peacefully. When we joined the galactic community, we hoped to find something better. Instead, we found the same patterns of fear and suspicion operating on a much larger scale. The relay station transmitted historical records that painted a detailed picture of humanity's role in galactic affairs. The data showed how human mediators had prevented or resolved an average of 17 potential conflicts per year. Medical. Researchers had developed treatments that worked across multiple alien biologies, saving millions of lives during various plague outbreaks. Engineers had designed infrastructure systems that different species could share despite their vastly different environmental needs. Most importantly, the records showed how humanity had deliberately avoided taking credit for most of their contributions. They had worked behind the scenes, sharing their innovations through carefully disguised research papers and technical specifications. They had mediated disputes without making other species feel dependent on human intervention. They had built defensive systems and early warning networks that protected everyone while appearing to be purely scientific projects. We wanted to be partners, not protectors, Dr. Foster explained. We believed that if we could demonstrate the benefits of cooperation without forcing it, other species would eventually choose to work together voluntarily. The Council's decision to expel us proved that we were wrong. Commander Ixel felt a growing sense of desperation as she listened to the transmission. The galaxy was falling apart without human involvement, but humanity had apparently moved beyond the reach of conventional diplomacy. How could the Council negotiate with a species that had literally created their own universe? Dr. Foster, is there any possibility that humanity might consider returning to help resolve the current crisis? She asked. The void spawn incursions have destroyed 12 star systems. The war between the Catherians and the Asari has spread to involve 8 different species, and our communication networks are failing completely. We are aware of the situation, came the reply. In fact, we have been monitoring the crisis and taking certain actions to limit the damage. The void spawn incursions could have been much worse if we had not secretly activated some of the defensive systems that Dr. Grant's team installed throughout the Outer Rim. The automated platforms are now operating under remote human control. This revelation stunned the search fleet's commanders. Humanity had been secretly protecting the galaxy even after being expelled from it. The defensive systems that had seemed broken were actually still functional, operated by human technicians working from their pocket dimension. However, Dr. Foster continued, we cannot solve the fundamental problems that led to our expulsion. The galaxy's species must learn to coexist without external mediation, or they will simply repeat the same mistakes again in the future. The transmission ended with coordinates for a meeting location deep in neutral space. The human diaspora. Council was willing to provide assistance in dealing with the immediate crisis, but they would not return to their former role as the galaxy's invisible guardians. If the Council wanted humanity's help, they would have to acknowledge their mistakes and demonstrate a genuine commitment to change. As the search fleet prepared to travel to the designated meeting point, Commander Ixel realized that finding humanity had been the easy part. Convincing them to save a civilization that had rejected them would prove much more difficult. Council Speaker Veltar stood before the emergency assembly, looking out at a chamber that was less than half full. 12 species had lost their representatives to the void spawn incursions, their home worlds consumed by crystalline predators that stripped away all organic life. 8 more delegations were missing, trapped behind war zones where former allies had become bitter enemies. The Great Hall that had once housed 43 different civilizations now echoed with the voices of fewer than 20. The galaxy was dying, and everyone knew that humanity held the key to saving it. The Human Diaspora Council has agreed to meet with our representatives, Veltar announced, his 4 eyes reflecting the weight of impending judgment. They have offered to provide assistance with the immediate crisis, but they have made it clear that they will not return to their former role without significant changes to how galactic civilization operates. The response from the remaining delegates was a mixture of relief and humiliation. Zeph High of the Aquatic Union spoke first, his translated voice carrying the shame that all of them felt. We expelled them for being too aggressive, and now we must beg them to save us from our own aggression. The irony is almost too bitter to bear. Irony does not matter now, declared Ambassador Nixara of the Crystal Consortium, her crystalline features reflecting the chamber's lights in patterns that indicated deep distress. My species has lost 3 colony worlds to the void spawn, and 2 more to the expanding war. If humanity can stop this destruction, we will accept whatever terms they demand. But the terms that emerged from the meeting with the Human Diaspora Council were not what anyone expected. Dr. Nancy Foster, speaking for humanity through a holographic projection from their pocket dimension, presented a proposal that challenged the very foundation of galactic governance. Humanity will provide immediate assistance to combat the void spawn threat and will share the technology needed to repair your communication networks, she began, her image flickering slightly as it transmitted across dimensional boundaries. However, we will not return to serve as mediators for species that refuse to take responsibility for their own conflicts. The proposal that followed was both elegant and demanding. Humanity would establish a series of cooperation academies throughout galactic space, institutions designed to teach different species how to resolve disputes without violence. The academies would be staffed by human instructors, but attendance would be mandatory for all council member species. Every diplomat, military officer, and government official would be required to complete courses in conflict resolution, cross-cultural communication, and cooperative problem-solving. You cannot legislate peace, Dr. Foster explained, but you can teach the skills that make peace possible. Humanity learned this lesson through centuries of warfare on our home world. We discovered that different groups can coexist, but only if they understand how to communicate effectively and resolve their differences constructively. The immediate crisis required more direct intervention. Human technicians, working from their pocket dimension, began remotely repairing the translation networks that had failed so catastrophically. The process was complex and slow, requiring careful recalibration of each system to account for the cultural nuances that automated systems could not understand. Dr. Ryan Cooper, transmitted as a holographic presence from the human dimension, worked directly with alien linguists to restore proper communication protocols. His expertise in xenobiological linguistics proved invaluable in fixing the subtle errors that had turned diplomatic conversations into declarations of war. The problem was never with the hardware, he explained to a joint committee of council representatives. Translation is not just about converting words from one language to another. It requires understanding the cultural context behind those words, the emotional undertones that give them meaning, and the historical associations that shape how different species interpret similar concepts. The war between the Catherians and the Asari ended not with a negotiated peace treaty, but with a shared revelation about how badly they had misunderstood each other. When the translation systems were properly repaired, both sides discovered that their enemies had been trying to apologize and seek peaceful solutions all along. The bloodshed that had consumed 8-star systems and killed millions of beings had been caused by nothing more than linguistic confusion. General Vorthak of the Catherian Empire and Ambassador Thexhai of the Asari Federation met in person. For the first time since the war began, this time with human linguists providing real-time translation assistance. The conversation that followed was painful for both leaders, as they realized how many lives had been lost due to their failure to communicate clearly. "We thought you were celebrating the deaths of our warriors," Vorthak said, his battle-scarred features showing genuine anguish. "In our culture, such celebration is the ultimate dishonor. And we thought you were rejecting our attempts at reconciliation," Thexhai replied, his aquatic features rippling with distress. "When our apologies were translated as threats, we assumed you intended to continue the violence." The Void Spawn crisis required a more direct military response. The defensive platforms that Dr. Paul Grant's team had installed throughout the Outer Rim were reactivated under human control. Their quantum disruptor weapons finally brought to bear against the crystalline invaders. The effect was immediate and devastating for the alien predators, whose seemingly invulnerable structures collapsed into harmless mineral dust when subjected to the proper resonance frequencies. But humanity's most important contribution was not technological, it was educational. The cooperation academies began operating within months of the crisis resolution, staffed by human instructors who had learned hard lessons about the consequences of uncontrolled conflict. Species that had been enemies for generations found themselves working together in classroom exercises designed to build trust and understanding. Captain Lisa Hayes, appearing as a holographic instructor at the Academy on Rigel Prime, addressed a mixed class of Catherian warriors and Asari diplomats. "Conflict is not inherently evil," she told them, her military bearing commanding respect from both groups. "Competition can drive innovation, disagreement can lead to better solutions, and even controlled conflict can strengthen relationships. The problem comes when conflict becomes destructive instead of constructive." The lessons were not easy for many species to accept. The Catherians struggled with concepts of compromise that their warrior culture saw as weakness. The Asari had difficulty trusting species that they had viewed as threats for centuries. The Crystal Consortium found it almost impossible to share decision-making authority with beings whose thought processes they considered fundamentally alien. But the alternative to learning cooperation was the gradual collapse of galactic civilization, and that reality provided powerful motivation for change. Species that had refused to work together for political reasons found themselves forced to cooperate out of simple necessity. The hegemony's trade networks could not function without Aquatic Union shipping expertise. The Crystal Consortium's mining operations required Xanthari engineering knowledge to remain profitable. The Asari Federation's agricultural systems needed seeds and genetic material that only other species could provide. Gradually, the galaxy began to heal. The communication network stabilized as human technicians completed their repairs and trained alien specialists to maintain them properly. Trade routes reopened as former enemies learned to trust each other enough to share shipping lanes and port facilities. The early warning systems for void spawn incursions were rebuilt with input from multiple species, creating redundant networks that could not be disabled by the loss of any single group. But humanity did not return to their former role as invisible guardians. They remained in their pocket dimension, accessible through the relay stations they had established throughout galactic space, but no longer present in the daily life of the galaxy. They provided consultation when requested, offered advice when asked, and continued to operate the cooperation academies, but they refused to serve as mediators for disputes that other species should learn to resolve themselves. "We made a mistake when we first joined the galactic community," Dr. Foster explained during a council session held 6 months after the crisis resolution. We thought we could solve everyone's problems for them, and in doing so, we prevented them from learning to solve problems for themselves. A parent who does their child's homework is not helping the child learn. Council Speaker Veltar, his position somehow retained despite his role in humanity's expulsion, addressed the human representative with a humility that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. We owe you an apology that can never fully express our regret. We judged you based on fear and misunderstanding, and we nearly destroyed ourselves as a result. Apologies are less important than actions, Dr. Foster replied. The question is not whether you feel sorry for your mistakes, but whether you have learned enough from them to avoid repeating them in the future. The galaxy that emerged from the crisis was different from the one that had expelled humanity in anger and fear.